Today I'm going to talk to you about Alice Shields' electronic opera Apocalypse. Just a note about the term electronic opera. It's not a perfect term, which I think we've all kind of encountered in our research with various terminology. And it basically, I'll use it to refer to all opera and music theater that contains technological musical components. So it is kind of a misleading term, but I haven't figured out a better one yet. So, all right. So before I introduce you to Alice Shields' Apocalypse, I'm just going to give a brief overview of electronic opera. So the field of electronic opera is somewhat understudied, although there have been some excellent research studies. There is a few really good studies that have been conducted from various angles, and these include Danielle Sofer's article on interculturality in Apocalypse, Momolali Ramström's case study of the production of Philip Manori's K, and Johan Stenström's work on Carl Beard Blomdahl's Aniara. These are all excellent studies, but I do think that there's room to make more connections in the history of electronic opera between opera and the development of technological musical elements as a whole, as well as between electronic operas themselves. So when we're discussing the history of electronic opera, I think it's important to consider the role that technology plays in each opera, because there is a huge variation in the way that that's been done. So here I just have a list of a few operas, which begins with Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre-Henri, and going up to Alice Shields. This is definitely not an exhaustive list of this time period. This is just a few examples. So the first electronic opera, or really electroacoustic opera, is Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre-Henri's Orphée 53. And this opera consists of a concrète tape track with singers, an orator, and a couple of live instruments, so quite modest performance forces. It wasn't a huge success in terms of reception, given that there was a big communication in breakdown between Schaeffer and the festival where he was putting it on. So in 1958, we have English composer Humphrey Searle's Diary of a Madman, and this opera is for orchestra with tape, and the tape track uses electronic sound effects to illustrate the deepening madness of the main character and various 20th century idioms in the orchestral writing. So in 1959, we have Carl Beard Blomdahl, the Swedish composer, his Aniara, the space opera. This is a really interesting work where he uses various electronic and recorded sounds to represent the voice of a character, which is artificial intelligence. And then Robert Ashley is a huge pioneer of multimedia theatrical works and opera for TV as well in the United States. So That Morning Thing is one of his early stage operas, and he uses a tape track of recorded and electronic sounds with live performers, lots of spoken word and dances. Ashley is quite prolific in his output and influence in the field of multimedia theatrical works. So then, of course, we have back to Stockhausen. He comes up in every presentation, I fear, but he wrote his monumental Licht cycle, which is about 29 hours of music. And this really is an electronische opera in the sense that he often uses synthesizers in his orchestra, which he called a modern orchestra. And he also uses recorded electronic sounds. A lot of the commissions that he got over the years went into this opera. He found a way to work them in. And I think by this point, all the operas have been performed, but obviously not all one after the other. That would be interesting though. And then we have Todd Marchover, who's another central figure in the United States. He's more on the electronic instrument side of things. So his opera Valis is a multimedia work which uses computer music and hyper instruments. So then on to Alice Shields. She has written 3 electronic operas: Shaman in 1987, Mass for the Dead in 1992, and Apocalypse in 1994, which has actually never been performed live, but exists purely on a CD format, which I will discuss. So I've been working on this timeline, which I will show you. So this is an interactive timeline that basically shows as many electronic operas as I've been able to discover. I'm up until about 2007 at the moment. I haven't gotten much further than that. It's a work in progress. But if you click on any of the works, you'll find some information about the opera, along with links to audio, if audio exists and is easily accessible, and maybe an article about the work. So I will drop a link to this timeline in the chat after the presentation. If you're interested, please take a look at it. And if you look at it and think, oh, there's a work that I love that you're missing, or just any work that I'm missing, feel free to send me an email. I would love to hear from you. So that's my timeline. So you can see we start to get a lot of activity around the 90s, which is when obviously home studios were becoming more popular. So people were kind of, technology was more democratized and accessible. So we get a lot of people making works in their home studios. All right. So a little bit of background on Alice Shields. She is an electronic music pioneer at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center. She has 3 degrees from Columbia. She studied with Vladimir Uzichevsky, amongst other people, and she served as the director of the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center from 1978 to 1982. She also had a career as an opera singer, and she's written many works which include voice and electronics in some capacity. So Apocalypse is an opera that was released on CD in 1994. The staging of the production was intended for singers, Bharatanatyam dance, which is an Indian classical style of dance, and tape. But obviously the version that we have does not contain the dance, unfortunately. She also, by this point, was using MIDI technology with virtual instruments to create her orchestral background in the tape track. So there were some other composers who were doing this kind of thing around that time. So we have Kyle Gann's Custer and Sitting Bull, which, if you don't know this work, I highly recommend checking it out. But he creates his tape track through various virtual instrument sounds tuned in Ben Johnston's Just Intonation. So this is really quite a practical use of MIDI sounds. He's able to get the exact pitch ratios that he wants. And then it's a one-man work, which he has performed many times, and he speaks over the tape track. So it's quite practical for touring purposes and stuff like that. And then we have Cynthia Sturnow's operas, beginning with Soul on the Dreamer in 1996. Cynthia Sturnow was improvising on a digital keyboard to write operas, and she felt that she could make really interesting layers with those MIDI sounds that she was using. And she felt that she didn't have the technical skill to orchestrate that at the time. So again, it's kind of a practical approach to using virtual instruments in opera. She actually studied with Alice Shields for a little bit as well. So with Alice Shields' use of MIDI with virtual instruments in her operas, it doesn't seem necessarily to come from a practical place. Not that that makes anything less artistically viable, but she has written quite a few acoustic operas, which she did have workshopped and performed at various times. So with her 3 electronic operas, Shaman, Mass for the Dead, and Apocalypse, she's going for kind of a specific sound world with each opera and her use of technology. So the technology in each opera develops from Shaman to Apocalypse. Shaman is for 4 singers, chorus, 4 live instruments and tape, so quite modest forces. Mass for the Dead is for 4 singers and a flexible combination of 4 live instruments and tape, and it has a narrator as well. Apocalypse is intended for 3 singers, tape, electric guitar, and dancers. So the idea for Apocalypse is that singers would sing along with a pre-recorded tape track accompanied by the dancers. So this is actually quite a difficult, it would be quite difficult to perform, although not impossible, I think. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the plot for Apocalypse. Shields details the plot in the really detailed liner notes for Apocalypse, which you can find online. So basically, as Shields says, in the plot, a woman seeks spiritual knowledge, which is the plot encapsulated in a sentence. So the central character, the woman, goes on a transformational journey where she encounters the seaweed, who is a goddess who often speaks in Irish, and Shiva. The seaweed imparts wisdom, where Shiva imparts sexual knowledge. So it's really a coming of age story. And then the Greek style chorus represents prudent objectors to the woman's journey. In the climax of the opera, the chorus tears apart Shiva and eats him. The woman puts him back together and they engage in a sexual ritual. The opera uses 4 different languages: English, Ancient Greek, Irish, and Sanskrit, which represents kind of Shields' ongoing interest in language and the sound of language, which she has had from an early age. So I'm going to discuss the musical materials in Apocalypse. So as I mentioned before, we have these quite jarring electronic instrument sounds, which would notably, we can notably recognize piano, percussion, strings, sitar, and harpsichord. We also have spoken word in Shields' voice, usually processed by analog devices. We have operatic and rock singing, as well as other singing styles by Shields and Michael Wilson. Michael Wilson performs the singing role of Shiva, but not the speaking role. And then we have the chorus, which is created by layering of Shields' voice. Finally, we have various nature sounds, often manufactured by Shields' voice as well. So the level of processing is an important tool that Shields uses for context and the narrative process. So in terms of the analog processing that Shields uses in the opera, Shields was still using the devices in the classical studio at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center. And she uses these mostly to process her own voice, which is kind of the connecting thread of the work. She has stated that many of these effects could be achieved nowadays live using Macs. But she also has stated that she prefers preset sounds to live ones. Her quote here, "I'm bored by stuff that's live usually because it can never be as carefully set or designed moment to moment," which I think is quite a strong opinion. But it does kind of show how, you know, she's a very structural thinker in some ways. So various analog processes used in Apocalypse include filtering, frequency shifting, speed, variation, reverb, and ring modulation. And on the devices in the studio, she would be able to make all these presets through which to process the sound. And processing ranges from quite subtle to very extreme in the opera. All right, in terms of the MIDI instruments and sounds, Shields has commented that MIDI technology made it easier to do precise pitches without working your tail off. So as you can imagine, the MIDI instrument sections are the more traditionally structured in terms of melody and harmony of the opera. The electronic sounds of the piano, percussion, strings, sitar, and harpsichord are quite easily connected to their acoustic counterparts. So you do get this interesting contextual sense of these acoustic instruments, but obviously they're transformed into this really kind of jarring idiom. So I'll play you a little bit of the beginning of the opera with the percussion sounds. So we're kind of immediately introduced to this sound world using these quite harsh MIDI sounds. And then I'll just play a little bit of the MIDI strings as well. All right. So in terms of vocal processing, as I said before, the level of processing shapes the narrative, so the characters and their interactions. The woman goes through similarly structured interactions with the seaweed and Shiva, with sections of dialogue, dances, and greetings. In the woman's interaction with the seaweed, they are both very calm, and we have the sound of waves in the background, which gives a kind of sonic image of the seaside. And then in the interaction with Shiva, the voice is deep, it's quite energetic and chaotic, quite mechanical. So I'll just play a little section of both of those. And the first voice that you hear is the woman's, and then the answer comes from either the seaweed or Shiva. All the voices are Shields though, so.
Holy Mother, sea-born mother of mountains and earth, the way you have described is frightening. It is lonely, a white one, wailing one, mother of the dark sea. For one whose soul is enlightened, full feeling is frightening.
So something that I really like in this section is that you get those little delay sounds, which really heighten those S syllables, which to me kind of creates a ripple effect. I'm not sure if that's, the intentional image, but to me, given the seaside context, that's how I would interpret it. And then I'll play a little bit of the interaction with Shiva.
What do you say? What do you say? Fivefold is the sacrifice of the senses. Fivefold the sacrificial body. And 5 seasons are there in the year of life.
So we can hear this is obviously much deeper, much more energetic with a much fuller spectrum of sounds, but we also have some of those delays and some pitch shifting. It's really quite mechanical. And the woman's character, her voice also changes in nature depending on who she's talking to, which kind of speaks to her transformational journey and the story of the opera. So Shields uses various nature sounds in the opera. These are some of my favorite sounds, and she creates bird sounds with her own voice, which are quite realistic. So in these 2 spectrograms, the first one shows real seagulls, the second one is Shields seagulls. So you can see that she has quite well captured the shape of the seagull sound, but she takes this kind of natural sound that she creates through her voice and places it in an alternate nature, which is the sound world of Apocalypse. I'll play both of these sounds. What I like about Shields seagulls as well is that there's really nothing in the background, so it becomes quite eerie, because as you'll hear in the real seagulls, you can't have seagulls without other sounds in the background. So I'll first play the real seagulls. So those are some legitimate seagulls, and then here's Shields seagulls with her own voice. So you get that really light processing of that delay, and also the hard panning, which is taking us into kind of a different universe in a very subtle way. So what I think is one of the high points of the opera is the scene where the chorus eats Shiva, and they collapse into sounds of chewing, burping, slurping, laughing, and singing, which is quite an unusual thing to have in kind of this type of dramatic work. So this scene is largely unprocessed as compared to the other scenes, which I find to be very effective, because with the bird sounds, Shields is recreating an actual natural sound and taking it out of its normal context, whereas this scene, Shields takes natural sounds and transforms them into a fantastical and grotesque image through the actual lack of processing. So I'm going to play a little bit of this. I will just warn you, it is quite grotesque. So here it is. So given that this scene comes in the height of Shiva and the woman singing, the highly processed voices and the processed chorus at that point, it is just a stark contrast to everything around it, which makes it more powerful, in my opinion. It becomes quite a convincing and effective way of conveying the image of eating flesh. And for this scene, Shields and Jim Mattis, who helped her with the opera, were eating yogurt and broccoli, and that's how they produced those sounds. So a few conclusions. I think that the combination of kind of the early virtual instruments with MIDI and the analog processing is quite unusual and of a certain time period, and I think unlikely to be replicated. So Shields uses the relationships that sound elements have to their source or their perceived source in combination with obvious manipulations, placing everything into this new environment full of very disparate sounds, which is the sound world of Apocalypse. And the opera is a blend of quite traditional sections and experimental sections inside quite a structured framework. I do think that the work would be hard to perform live, given that live singers would have to sing along with the tape track, which is quite challenging. And it has never been performed live, so we have no idea of how much of a challenge that would really be. Part of the reason for this is, as Shields says, I go on to other projects and don't market my stuff being into the next thing I'm creating, which I think a lot of us as creators can kind of relate to. So I do think it's unlikely that we'll see a live performance of Apocalypse, but I think that the CD is an excellent resource and historical artifact, and a look into a specific type of electronic opera. All right, thank you.